So we're going to talk about reverse addiction today, or what I call reverse addiction. Now, you probably know this term as codependence. That's probably how you'll have heard it. Why do I use a different term? Well, codependence in the first place is a medical term. It's a psychological term. And I think my approach, I would say, has moved on somewhat from the medical model. You'll get to know this as you listen to my stuff. I talk about addiction as an inappropriate relationship. So we don't view it purely as a medical condition or an illness. Secondly, I think codependence is a more broad term. It covers relationships where addiction isn't present, for instance. So when we use the term reverse addiction, it's pretty clear we're focusing in on the idea of not just addiction, but a particular form of addiction. So I think this video or series of videos, there could be 3, there could be 5, I would say they'll be useful certainly for partners. That's the initial idea, the intimate partners, close partners of addicts. But I think it would also and will also be useful for families, friends, work colleagues to understand a little better what's motivating you in the way that you engage with your addict. And that's, of course, what it's all about. It's understanding yourself and understanding the way you are triggered, motivated, and in some ways constrained when dealing with your addict. So where did this term reverse addict come from, and how did we sharpen it up to this point? Well, most of you will know, who are listening to this, I'm a systemic psychotherapist, so my focus is always on the family, it's always on relationship. And for many years I worked in treatment centres, in residential rehabs as they're called, and the most difficult calls that I would take came from family members or partners. Often they'd spend all their money in sending the addict to the treatment centre. They were often sitting there with their feet up in the treatment centre getting detox drugs and all kinds of support and counselling. And someone would ring and say, you know, how's he doing or how's she doing? And they would be desperate. You know, they'd be at home, they'd say, well, you know, I've spent all my money to get them there and I'm getting no support at all. Now, the better rehabs will support and will have family days and so on, of course, but I wouldn't say the focus is ever particularly on the family, but it's so important. So why were these calls so difficult? Well, because my understanding would be that this person, this family, these parents, these grandparents, they would need as much in the way of recovery and in the way of treatment as the addict does, but they were getting nothing. And secondly, I think there was a concern, there's always a concern from myself that when the addict got out, having had all this theoretical recovery treatment, I say theoretical because of course in residential you're not in your real life, so it can't be real, it's always theoretical. When they come back out into their real life, they may have got a lot of schooling and a lot of ideas as to how to be different, but their mates, their partner, their parents, their grandparents, their friends, their work colleagues, they won't have necessarily had anything. And so this is very problematic. And I think if you talk to people who've been in residential, they'll say this can be a big issue. So how do we get to the idea of reverse and how do we get to the idea of addict? Let's go into that now in a little bit more detail in this first video so that it sets a good context for what's to follow. So if I had the objects of addiction on the table in front of me, as well as my tea and my laptop, etc., what would you see? If we had a pile of marijuana here, if we had a pile, maybe some bags of heroin, some crystal meth, maybe a big bottle of alcohol, maybe the office keys for work, you know, or a gambling slip, you know, the objects of addiction. If we look at it as an inappropriate relationship, then we may start to notice a theme here. As we look at all this addiction type stuff, we may be struck by the idea that all these things are inert. They're all dead. There's no life in any of them. Now, you might say, well, that's obvious, or you may not have thought of it at all, but it's often missed in the way that addiction is treated. It's often completely missed that actually what's going on is that we've been attracted into a relationship with something that's dead. Now, as we think about that, we can also think about the reverse idea. We can say, well, we're also being attracted out of or away from living relationships. So this is at the heart of what we might call isolation, and it's certainly at the heart of the way I treat addiction, because we are hardwired to bond with something. You know, right from being born, we're bonding with mum. We're hardwired to bond with something around us. And if, for any reason, we find that bonding too difficult, then we will start to be attracted, or we'll start to bond with things that aren't alive, because they're less threatening. And I go into all of that in some of my other videos, but I just wanted to set that as a context, because in reverse addiction, it's actually the only form of addiction that includes living things. So there's your comparison, your contrast straight away. You say, well, this is the same but different. It's addiction in my book, but it's what I call reverse addiction, because you're actually addicted now back into the living, but in a very particular way. So that is, I would say, a move on from codependence, but it will include certain psychological terms. We're going to talk in a further video about narcissism and the way that the narcissistic personality is developed here. But most importantly, I wanted to set this context to say how we're going to look at this is through this lens of living and dead things, because we're going to say that whether you're a family member, whether you're a work colleague, whether you're a friend, or even, you know, a grandparent or a married partner of the addict, that you need recovery just as much as the addict does. Now, this can be very challenging because often you're in a desperate situation. Often I know from my own personal experience that you who are listening to this and looking at this, you may be working, you may be paying all the bills, you may be being honest, you may be desperately trying to love this person. You may have tried everything. It will certainly have been driving you mad, I know that. Whilst they're doing all the wrong things, aren't they? They're using the drugs maybe, or you know, they're never available, or they can't talk, or they're emotionally disconnected. There's all sorts of reasons why you could quite naturally see the problem as residing in them. You know, if only they'd sort themselves out, if only they would recover, surely everything would be fine. And this is such a trap. It's such a trap as an idea, because it's just not true. If we go back even as far as 1935, where the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous said alcoholism is a family condition. Now, as I say, we've moved on from the medical model, and AA is right slap it in the middle of the medical model, as it were. We've moved on from that to some degree, but look how far back we can go, and they understood even then that this is not a condition in the way that you might get a bug personally, and it's just you that's got it and no one else. That we understand that this is a relational difficulty. And I think our understanding has developed a lot more since then. And we can say now that it definitely is a relational difficulty, not just in terms of the important relationships, but in terms of the way we relate to others. And that is just as true for what I call the reverse addict as it is for the addict. So I want you to take that on board, and I can put it into a principle for you so that you can digest this before maybe you look at the next video in this series. The principle goes like this. If you can imagine me, say, going to work with a new family. Now there's an addicted family member, or maybe more than one, in that family. And the family will sit down with me as we set out the work, and I will say to them, we're going to approach this systemically, which means we're going to approach it relationally. And what that means is that the level of challenge, how we challenge people, how we challenge ourselves, is going to be the same for the addict, it's going to be the same for the family, and it's going to be the same for myself as the therapist. In other words, if we challenge the addict more than we challenge ourselves, something's going wrong there. So this idea of challenge is very important when it comes to this way of treating addiction. So even though you may have an addict who is really not in recovery at the moment, or you may be a family member desperately hoping to hear something that will help you help them recover, well, this is it. This is the beginning of that, because I want to assure you that the best thing you can do for your addict is to recover yourself. Now, that may be a very challenging idea for you because, as I say, you may be looking at them as the problem. Well, I want to change that. I want to challenge that idea for you in the very first video on this series. I want you to understand that you are just as afflicted as they are. And if you don't understand that, then what's going to happen is you're going to be chasing each other around for many years and getting more and more frustrated. So there's some big ideas for you to digest as we think about ending this first video. I'm going to plan maybe 2, 3, 4 or 5 more on this series because we want to go into depth with this and we want to help you as much as we can. So see you on the next one.